Will PC and console players ever get along? If you're sick of Halo Infinite cheaters, you might like what Phil Spencer had to say in a recent interview, and Xbox Series X and S consoles might be selling just as well as PS5s. Let's discuss. Now, at this point, it's pretty well documented that the Xbox One was a low point in Microsoft's history of Xbox. In the Xbox documentary they put out on YouTube, they're pretty vocal about how much of a hot mess the Xbox One era was for Microsoft. For those of you who don't remember, Xbox One basically launched like this. They said, hey, you remember Xbox 360? We had these revolutionary games, and we took online gaming to the next level with Xbox Live, and it was awesome, right? Well, if you love that, then you're gonna love this. We basically forgot all about that, and we're gonna turn your Xbox One into a family entertainment hub, an entertainment system. We'll bundle the Kinect in, you can plug your cable box into the Xbox so you can yell at your Kinect to change channels, and we're gonna add this really confusing digital rights legal kind of mess that will make it impossible for you to buy and sell used games. It'll be great. And people said, what? No, that sounds terrible. What are you talking about? People voiced their displeasure, obviously, when they revealed the Xbox One, and they tried very hard to kind of backtrack on some of those things that I just mentioned before it launched, but the damage was already done, and it was something that they would never fully recover from. They went on to sell 41 million Xbox Ones. Compare that to 116 million units sold for PS4, and it's not even close. PS4 just dominated Xbox One that whole era, and even if you have fond memories of your Xbox One, maybe it was your first console, you know, the market spoke, right? The numbers spoke, and they said, this guy right here, this guy that I have in my hands right here, was irrelevant, right? It was a low point in history. I only have this guy because at the time when it released, I was in college, and like a lot of college students, I was poor. And they were running this insane trade-in deal at Best Buy, where if you traded in your Xbox 360, you got a crazy discount on this. And it even came bundled with a few games. I got Assassin's Creed Unity and Black Flag, and I think one other game for cheap. I don't even think I spent above $200 for this whole thing. But when it's all said and done, I wouldn't have missed out on much if I decided to go PlayStation 4 last generation. My most played games on this were Overwatch, I'm pretty sure, and The Witcher 3, which are multi-plat games, so that's something I could have played on the PlayStation 4, in addition to all of the games that came out last generation, like God of War, Last of Us, all those guys. Since then, Seamus Blackley, who is widely considered to be the father of Xbox, took to his Twitter and had his own admission, his own thoughts on when the Xbox One launched. He said, there was a moment at the Xbox One launch that I thought it was over. Honestly. And that's pretty huge, right? Because if it was over, like he was quote unquote putting it, and the Xbox died right there, they didn't make any consoles, that would be huge. We haven't seen a console die out since Sega Dreamcast, and I'm still pretty sad about that. Luckily, they turned it around when Phil Spencer took over. They went all in on Game Pass, they made some huge acquisitions in terms of studios, and they did a lot of good work on the backwards compatibility front. Luckily, those dark days seem to be behind us, and I'm super excited for Xbox's comeback because I really feel like they balance out the gaming industry, and Xbox's presence has driven some innovation, whether you want to admit it or not. On the backwards compatibility front, they have other consoles, other platforms kind of going in that direction as well. Spartacus over at PlayStation is apparently going to have a lot of backwards compatible titles coming on the top tier, and Nintendo, they have their expansion pack, which makes classic N64 and Sega Genesis titles playable on the Switch. So things like that, I mean, I just can't imagine if Xbox really did die. What would happen? It's a really interesting hypothetical to think if they had doubled down on the path that they were going at the beginning of the Xbox One era. Now, thinking back, it kind of makes sense why there's some anger, some vitriol from other fans on other platforms, especially PlayStation, because for that whole generation, 7-8 years, PlayStation dominated Xbox, and now that they're becoming relevant again, I can see how it's ruffling some feathers. I, for one, am grateful that Xbox is making this comeback. You know, I feel like it balances out the whole gaming industry, right? And they're driving some pretty interesting innovations. Their work on backwards compatibility, for example, preserving classic titles. has kind of prompted the other companies to say, hey, we kind of want to do something like that too. Spartacus over on Sony PlayStation, the top tier is apparently going to have a whole slew of PlayStation 1, 2, and 3 titles. And over on Nintendo Switch, you got the expansion pack, which is for classic Nintendo 64 games and Sega Genesis. I think there's something to be valued with all three of the companies. I'm glad that they're all sort of living in harmony, right, for now. But it is interesting to think, it's an interesting hypothetical to think, what if Microsoft doubled down on the Xbox One and the direction it was going? What would the video game landscape look like? It's interesting. Speaking of Xbox being relevant again, according to recent reports, we have reason to believe that the Xbox Series X and S are closing the gap on PS5s in terms of sales. Now, Microsoft does not release actual sales numbers when it comes to their gaming consoles, but a recent quote from Phil Spencer gives us a little bit more of an idea of how many Xbox Series X and S consoles have been sold. He says supply is actually as big as it's ever been. It's that demand is exceeding the supply for all of us. At this point, we've sold more of this generation of Xboxes, which is the Xbox Series X and S, than we had at any previous versions of the Xbox. Now, I feel like this can be pretty easily misinterpreted, but the gist of it is that a year in, Xbox Series S and X has sold more than a year in of Xbox One, a year of Xbox 360. Now, the interesting part to me in this quote is the supply part. The perception right now is that there are console shortages everywhere. There's a supply shortage. And here Phil Spencer is saying there's no supply shortage. We actually have more units than we ever had before. It's just that demand is exceeding even that supply that we have. Now, this is most likely due to Xbox bolstering their overall units with the Xbox Series S. People are starting to realize, hey, if I can't get an Xbox Series X right now, I can just pick up the Series S for cheaper and it plays all the same games. Now, if what he's saying is true, and Xbox Series X and S has sold more in a year than Xbox 360, Xbox One, then that's pretty interesting, right? Because we know that a year in, Xbox 360 sold about 12 million. And Xbox One sold about 10 million. So we know that Xbox Series X and S consoles have sold more than 12 million if we're going by Phil Spencer's quote. And we don't know how much, but if it's 13, 14 million, that's pretty good, right? When I last checked how many PlayStation 5s were sold, it was about 13 million, but that was back in October, so there's probably been more sales in terms of that, probably more like 17, 18 million maybe. But still, that's not as wide of a gap as we were initially thinking. Now, Sony, when you compare the two, they haven't been able to match the year one numbers that they achieved with the PlayStation 4. And that's probably because they do have a supply shortage. It's well documented, but they're also kind of on the downturn a little bit, right? A little bit. They said that they were hoping to ship by the end of the fiscal year in March 2022, 22 million units, 22 million PS5s. But it turns out it's going to be more like 15 million. I'm not saying that people don't want a PS5 anymore or Xbox is better and more people want Xboxes, but I'm saying that this gap between the consoles, and Xbox has a lot of work to do, especially when you account last generation of Xbox, but it's shaping up to be a pretty competitive race in terms of sales. And when all is said and done, I think these consoles, the Xbox Series X and S and the PlayStation 5s, will go down as probably one of the most popular, most widely sold consoles ever. So Microsoft seems to be moving in this direction where they want to create more of a gaming ecosystem rather than having it separate with, you know, Xbox console players and then separating the PC players, and that's led them to include crossplay between Xbox consoles and PC, meaning that if you're playing a game on your Xbox and your friend over on PC has the same game, you can play it together, like in Halo Infinite, like in Call of Duty Warzone. Now, I think this is cool, right? Most of my friends, all of my friends on Halo Infinite play on PC. And if there was no crossplay, I would not be able to play with any of my friends. I would either have to make a whole new group of friends, which is pretty hard to do when you're an adult. I feel like my older viewers will corroborate that for me, or buy a PC, which is super expensive. Here's where the problem is. Xbox forces you to opt in to crossplay, meaning you have no choice other than to mingle with PC players if you're on console and console players if you're on PC. And that's what has people mad. A lot of people are very upset about that. Back when Halo Infinite dropped its multiplayer in November, PC cheaters had already started to appear. And when you're a console player and you run into someone who is cheating on PC, you're defenseless, right? You can't cheat back because it's not as easy to install some of the cheating programs on your Xbox, virtually impossible, I would say, as you can on your PC. And those calling for them to stop mandatory crossplay between PC and Xbox have only gotten louder, and for good reason, right? Because encountering a cheater just sucks. No matter what you do, it just sucks. And at the end of the day, you shouldn't have to be forced to do anything when it comes to your gaming experience. It's also super frustrating because over on PlayStation side, you can disable crossplay. For example, if you're playing Call of Duty Warzone on your PlayStation console, you can disable the option to not play with any PC players. Over on Xbox, you can do that, but when you load into a playlist, it'll ask you to re-enable crossplay. On Halo Infinite, there's no option unless you want to do duos or singles. But if you're doing quick play, ranked arena, any other game type, you have to opt in to crossplay. It's doubly frustrating because that all just shows that it's something that you can do, right? You can disable crossplay, and that is totally doable. I don't know why they're forcing it on us. Even Battlefield 2042, it launched with forced crossplay on Xbox consoles. But even with all of their problems, they still had the awareness to disable that feature, and that just proves that it can be done, and what's taking so long? Just give us the option. When it comes to shooters, I really don't know if crossplay will ever truly be a thing. Now, it's not an issue if you're playing Fall Guys or Dauntless, you know, that's not so much of a hotly debated topic when it comes to games like that, crossplay on games like that. But in shooters, especially when people get so competitive, I really don't think that they'll be able to ever get along. Over on console, from a console player's view, they're so paranoid about PC cheaters that they don't want to deal with them. And on the PC side, they don't like the fact that people with controllers have aim assist. They think it's an unfair advantage. So I really don't think that it's going to be a thing going forward. People have tried to make it a thing, like Sea of Thieves, which for the longest time people were like, oh, this is a shining example of crossplay between consoles and PCs. Eventually, even those guys had to disable mandatory crossplay. You know, it's sad to say, but people just seem to want to game with other console players or other PC players, and that's okay. But people like me, sometimes I like to play with PC players. It's not that hard, just give us the option to do so. Now, if you are just fed up with cheaters, then this interview with Phil Spencer might be sounding pretty good to you. He said something I would love for us to be able to do, and this is hard as an industry, is when somebody gets banned in one of our networks, is there a way for us to ban them across other networks? Now, this is an interesting idea because if you cheat, you should be banned, right? And because you're a cheater, you're probably the type of person that would try to do it regardless of the platform. He also put forth the idea of having your own personal block list travel with you to other platforms. He said, and I love to be able to bring them to other networks where I play. So this is a group of people that I choose not to play with because I don't want to have to recreate that in every platform that I play video games on. This wouldn't just apply to cheaters though if it was up to Phil Spencer. He says they're continually working on AI over at Microsoft that detects when a conversation becomes destructive. And now a lot of people, they're gonna roll their eyes, they're gonna say, man, this dude, he would never survive in a Call of Duty lobby back in my day, man, he's so soft. But, you know, I get it. Like, trash talk, it's just a part of gaming, right? And back when split screen was still a thing, it was like mandatory, right? Just talking trash, talking crap to your friends while you're playing the game. But it has evolved into something so crazy, and it is just absurd, some of the things that people do and say and how they act. If a video game enrages you to that point, if your anger issues are so pronounced that playing a video game will trigger you to go into a rage, you shouldn't be playing video games, and you shouldn't be allowed, and like, people shouldn't have to put up with that. I was there, I grew up, you know, in the early days of online gaming, played through Xbox Live on my 360. I understand that people use certain language, they act a certain way, and back then, I used to think that's just how adults acted, man. That's how people talk when you grow up. And then I grew up and I realized, what the heck? No one talks like that. I lived in South Philadelphia for 8 years, and I went to maybe some of the seediest dive bars in the area, and I still didn't find people talking the way that some people talk online in video games. It goes along with this weird trend that when you're playing a game online, you can just say and do and act in a way that you would never act in real life. And if you were to do some of that stuff, if you were to act the way that some of these people act online in real life, there would be consequences. Of course there would be consequences. So this is something I would agree with. I know that there's going to be a lot of tough guys like, not me, I always say what's on my mind no matter if I'm online or if I'm in the store and face to face with you. I'm a tough guy. This is a problem. It's grown exponentially as gaming has evolved, and I have to agree with him on this. I really do. Anyway, guys, that's all the news I have for today. If you're tuning in for the first time, my name is Ray, and I would greatly appreciate it if you went on over to Twitter and followed me at StayXboxReady. I'm also doing a giveaway. I'm giving away an Xbox Series X to one lucky viewer. Stay tuned for more instructions, and we'll see you in the next video.